Curious about the why behind my photo edits? This full edit breakdown explains everything. I'll show you step by step how I edited this photo, explaining the reasoning behind each adjustment. Plus, I'll be giving away my new Lightroom Tools preset pack during the video, so don't miss out. Today's edit will be a bit different. We'll be going through it live, no cuts, so you can see my entire thought process as I edit the photo. Let's jump into Lightroom. The first thing I like to try and do when I'm editing a photo is try and visualize what I want to achieve. This grass underneath the chin here is very distracting, so I'm definitely going to get rid of that. And the light is a little bit flat. The light is coming from behind the lion. You can see in the lion's eyes here, it's reflecting from behind there. So I'm going to emphasize the light coming from the back. I'm going to darken the foreground. I want to bring in some more mood to this photo. I like the composition and I like the tall grass, but the overall lighting is a little bit flat. So I'm going to achieve more dynamic lighting for the image. First thing I like to start doing is choose the color profile. But before I go there, I want to show you this initialize presets. I spoke about the initialize presets last week in a Lightroom tips video. And what I do is I've created an initialize photo starting point preset here. By the way, this Lightroom Tools version 1.0, this preset pack is available through the description below. Make sure to stay subscribed to my email list because this Tools preset pack will be updated constantly. And if I've got your email address, I can send out the update as I keep adding more and more tools. So I'll click initialize photo. That's basically going to get rid of the sharpening. It's going to add chromatic aberration correction, and it's going to just zero out all of the sliders. Now the profile I start with, I normally use Adobe Standard version 2 if the image is not very contrasty. Sometimes if the image is a bit drab, it's a bit desaturated, I might use Adobe Landscape. That brings in a lot more color. Sometimes I like to use the color profile matching to my camera, that is the flat profile here. I use that if the image is very contrasty. But for this one, I think I'm going to choose Adobe Standard V2 to start with. Now to start off with, I'm going to drop the exposure. I feel like the image is a bit bright, and to bring in some more mood to the photo, I want to darken a lot of the image. Then I'm going to raise the blacks to soften the shadows. And I'm going to raise the highlights, or the whites I should say, to bring in some more contrast. Basically the whites slider is moving the white point of the image to the right hand side. The black slider is moving the black point, and I don't like to have a lot of very, very dark blacks in my image. So that's why the black slider is quite high. And then I'm dropping the contrast or the exposure on the midtones mainly using this exposure slider. So already there you can see we've added some nice contrast. Might just darken that a touch more. I'm going to add a lot of light from the back, so it does look a bit maybe underexposed at the moment, but that is going to be changed. So that is a good starting point there. I might play around with the white balance. The image here is as shot, the white balance is as shot. I'm going to hit auto to let Lightroom do an automatic adjustment there. And it's looking a bit warm, so I might just drop the temperature and the tint. It's looking a little bit too magenta. Something around about there. That's a nice starting point. All right, the next thing I want to do is look at the light. I want to add in some light. I'm not going to adjust any of the colors at the moment. I want to first work on the major changes to this image. And definitely I want to brighten the back. I'm going to darken this very immediate foreground here. So we'll do the foreground darken. I'm going to select on my preset pack here, foreground linear darken 1. I'll click number 2 just to see what it does. They slightly do different things, but I'm going to start with that darken 1, go into my foreground darken mask there, just to tweak it a little bit. I might add in some darker blacks at the bottom, just to add in some contrast to that section while I darken it down. Around about there, and I might cool it down very slightly just to offset that foreground, that immediate blurry foreground there, off from the entire image. So I'm pretty happy with that. That's with the foreground darken off, and now with it on. You can adjust this amount slider here if you think it's just a little bit too much. So I'll just use that slider there to tweak it a little bit. The next thing I'm going to do is add some light coming from the back. Now to do this, you want to basically select only the background. So what I'm going to do is I could choose select background here, which should do a good job of isolating the subject from that selection. Now I want to subtract the foreground here. I don't want to edit or change the brightness on the foreground. I want to keep that dark. So I'm going to subtract a linear gradient. I'm going to click and drag. Quite a very broad gradient there. It creates a very soft transition zone. I'm going to increase the exposure to brighten the background. Now this exposure brightening is going to be quite a tricky process to achieve. It's not going to be accomplished using just one mask. It's going to need quite a few masks. So that's a nice starting point. I might increase the white balance. And then I might try add some negative dehaze. And then I'm going to take the black slider and bring that up. That's going to soften all the contrasts out of that section there. So if you imagine light coming through an area, there's a lot of particulate air that light is shining through. So it will give a very hazy appearance. So that's the first mask we've adjusted for the background there. I'm going to do another one. I'm going to zoom out here first. I'm going to use a radial gradient. Very, very large radial gradient. And I'm focusing mainly on this edge of this gradient from 0% to 50%. This feather line is where 50% of the mask will be applied. And this 0% here is where nothing is applied. So I'm going to just brighten up that very corner there. I'm going to adjust the white balance to make it warmer. You can imagine light coming from the back is going to have a much warmer appearance than the foreground. The foreground should be a little bit darker and maybe a bit cooler. So I'm happy with that. I might just raise the blacks up a little bit more there. And then the dehaze just to add in some more of that hazy light coming from the back. All right, that's looking good. That's the before, that's what we started out with, that's the after. So now what I want to look at is, I'm going to remove this distraction here under the chin. I don't like to remove a lot of detail from the image, especially of the landscape. I like this little bit of grass there, and this grass there is not too distracting. But this one under the chin, it's distracting, and I will remove that. So I'm going to select my remove tool here. Now I'm going to use this generative AI. Now you can see it's got this exclamation mark saying that it's not online. So I'm just going to go back online quickly, and you'll see that that will open up the opportunity to use generative AI. I think for this, especially around the mouth here, I think generative AI should do a very good job. And there we go, the option is available. So I'm clicking remove, I'm clicking generative AI. I'm going to increase the size of the tool here. I'm just going to click on the area that I want to get rid of. Be quite precise. You'll see it should generate the bottom of that lion's throat there. So I'm just going to subtract as close to that line as possible. Perhaps something like that. And then click apply. And it normally takes quite a while to achieve this. So I'll fast forward this section of the video and show you the result. And let's see what it's done. And it's done an excellent job there. It looks perfect. Now I'm just going to remove, without the generative AI, just this little speck here. I think it's actually a fly. I'm just going to get rid of that. All right, that's looking much better. Now I want to start working on the colors. And this is going to be a very give and take sort of process. I'm going to enhance the lion especially, and I'm going to desaturate some of this green and try and emphasize more warm light coming from the background. But I think let's start with working on the subject. So I'm going to say select subject to create a mask. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to feather the selection from the left hand side just using a linear gradient. I don't want the effects of what we're going to add to the lion to be applied to the very edge. That's basically almost creating a type of a vignette effect, just feathering it off there, if that makes sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the exposure just a little bit, just to bring up the midtones. I'm going to add some negative blacks just to bring some more contrast, very, very subtle. And the whites, I'm going to brighten that up. What I might do here is just brighten up the whole subject a little bit there. And then maybe drop down some of these highlights just to soften a very bright part of the lion's fur on the outside of the face there. Now I'm going to drop the exposure again. I want to decrease the overall brightness of the image. Flatten out the blacks again. I like to move the black points away from the left of the histogram, especially in nature images. So you'll often see me dragging that blacks up there. Now the difference between the black slider and the shadow slider is if you use the shadow slider, it keeps the black points where it is initially set. So it's basically only working, if you can look on the histogram here, the shadow slider is only working on that section. It's not affecting this black section here. And because I like to bring up the detail in the shadows with the black points being raised, I need to use the black slider. If you add the shadows, if you add too much shadows, it robs the image of contrast. And although I do use shadows from time to time on a very small scale, I normally use the black slider, which gives me the desired effect. I'm going to go back to the subject mask just to raise it up just a little bit there and bring down the overall exposure down again. Now I'm going to add another mask onto the background, another radial gradient. I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to make this one a lot bigger, and I'm going to then subtract the subject because we don't want this effect to be added to the subject. So now again, I'm going to raise the black points of that background. You can see the more I raise it, the more that effect is very apparent. And to add in some light coming from the background, don't always use exposure. Rather, look at other tools you can use, because if you use exposure, it can become quite contrasty. I like to do it in a lot softer way. Just by raising the black slider, you can see it's a lot more natural. Also add in some negative dehaze that also adds a nice softening effect, and it removes almost some of those details there. And then I'll warm that up quite a bit. That's creating quite a nice effect there. Okay, so the overall image is looking quite warm. I'm going to add in some color grading to the shadows using blue. I normally start around an area of about 220 on the hue. Now, if you go more towards purple, it starts looking unnatural, and anything that's more towards a more green color also looks unnatural. So I find an area of about 220% or 220 on the hue value is about a good starting point. And then I normally add in too much color grading here just to see what the color is doing. And then a nice technique is to go to this balance slider. So now this is going to put that blue tint into the shadows in different ways. So if I take this balance slider all the way down to -100, it's basically affecting the whole image. And if I make the balance slider 100, it's basically not adding any blue color because we've basically limited that area for the color grading to fall in. So what I do then is just drop it down just until the blue starts appearing where I want it to be appearing. And then I normally add in some darkening here using this slider. And blending basically blends these three color grading sections or these areas together. Obviously now we don't have anything on the highlights and midtones, so you won't see an effect there. We're going to blending of 100. It's going to now let those shadows blend into the midtones and the highlights a bit more. So I'll just leave that at the default of 50. Maybe something like that. It's a very subtle change, just adding some blue into the shadows there. I want to look at the white point. I want to make this image as bright as I can. Now, if you hold down Alt and you drag this white slider all the way, you should see areas starting to overexpose. Now, on this overlay here, the areas that are in red, the red channel is clipped, and the red color is clipped, and all those other yellows and purples, you can see those colors are clipped. Where it's white, all of the colors are clipped. So you basically lost detail there. So I'm holding down the Alt. I'm just going to bring back the white slider just to where I see no clipping. And now I know the image is as bright as I can make it. I might just drop down the exposure. And I think I'm going to bring in some contrast here. Now, I made a video about the contrast slider, so you can use that, but it's going to affect the shadows and the highlights at the same time. I don't really want to add in equal amounts of contrast in the highlights and in the shadows. So I'm rather going to go to the tone curve, and I'm going to use this point curve here to selectively brighten or darken areas. I'm going to selectively use the tone curve to selectively add contrast to different areas. I want to brighten up some of these midtones. So if you click this little selector tool here, you can actually go over the image and click and drag where you want the brightening or the darkening to take place, respective to a point that it places on this tone curve here. So if you look at the tone curve, you can see the point moving. So I'm going to click on a midtone that I want to increase the exposure on, or increase the brightness on. I'm going to click and drag that up. And then a shadow, I'm going to come down here and to click and drag to drop the exposure. Possibly something like that. It's maybe a bit too much, so I can manually just pull this point up here. Another thing I like to do is roll off the blacks. So to basically make the blacks appear more very, very dark gray. This effect will work well, especially shooting into the light. If you can imagine, the light source from the top right-hand corner here is basically almost shining into your lens. So it's going to affect the blacks a lot. You won't find a lot of very, very black areas in an image if you're shooting directly into the sun. So I'm going to roll that off at the bottom there. I'm basically just clicking on the bottom, clicking and dragging that up. Just manually, just trying to adjust the contrast to taste. Now, I think some of these highlights on the line are getting a bit too bright, but I think that's okay because that's basically the light source shining onto that. On the tone curve, you've got this refined saturation. So basically, when you add contrast, you're going to add more color, more saturation. So this slider allows you to desaturate and move the image back to what it was before you added the tone curve, roughly speaking. So I'm just going to adjust the saturation. Just dial it back a little bit from what we added in terms of contrast. There's some more adjustments I want to make to this image before I work on the color. The color is getting really strange at the moment, but I'm not worrying about that now. I'll sort out the color right at the end. And I think I'm going to do some burning on this line. I want to darken some areas. So on my preset pack here, I've got subject burn. Now that's basically going to create a mask on the subject and apply an exposure of -1. Just click it here. You can see it's named the mask subject burn, and it's got an exposure of -1 here. So the idea with the subject burn and the subject dodge is for you to intersect this with a brush. So I'll go click intersect, select brush. I'm going to zoom in. Now anywhere I paint, it's going to apply the effect. So as soon as I start painting on the neck here, you'll see the effects be removed from the line. So here I'm going to start painting. It's going to intersect the subject mask with this brush here. I'm going to darken this area on the outside because basically this area of the line is not reflecting any sunlight. So you can see it's being darkened quite nicely. I feel like it's getting a little bit blue, so I might just increase the white balance just a touch there, just to create a more natural color balance on the line there. That's what we've done with the subject burn. You can do that with radial gradients, but I like to use a brush to paint in different areas and really focus in the effect. Now I'm going to go to 200% here, and I want you to have a look at this area of the mouth. I'm going to zoom out. That area on the mouth there is very distracting. It's catching my eye quite a lot. An area of brightness will attract your attention. Now I want to darken that area. So I'm again using the brush on the subject burn mask just to darken that down. And that's looking a lot better. It's darkened that down nicely and it's taken the attention away from that area. I might do it on the nose here as well. Going real close in here. Just burning that down a little bit there. Maybe some more on this mouth here. I think the eyes are fine. I want the viewer to be attracted to those eyes, so I'm going to leave it bright there. So that's the subject burn mask off, and that's on. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to affect the eyes in two different ways. I'm going to create a brush mask. I'm going to zoom in to, let's say, 400%. Now I'm going to paint on the very bright parts of this eye here. Just with a basic brush. And I'm going to raise the white slider. Now that's going to push the white point of that area a lot higher. You could increase the exposure, but what that's doing is it's basically taking the whole area and raising the exposure across that whole spectrum of tones. So now doing it with just the whites, it's basically pushing contrast into the highlights of just that area. And basically why I brighten that section of the eye, that's the area the eye is reflecting from the light, or the sky actually. So I might just warm that up a little bit there. Just zoom out, you can see that that's given a lot of depth to that eye there. That's the effect on, off, and on. Let's just zoom in there. You can see it's created quite a nice effect on the eye there. And then what I'm going to do next with another brush is I'm going to paint the whole eye. And I'm going to add in some clarity just to this section. So that's going to add in a little bit of a darkening effect and add in some more details. I might just add in some texture as well. And then I might increase the exposure very, very slightly. You need to zoom out here and just make sure it doesn't look ridiculous. So I would say something around about 0.2 on the increase there. You can see that that's just adding some nice detail in there. And then we're just brightening that nicely there. So that basically sharpens up the tones on the eye, just to add in some more emphasis of detail there, and also the direction of the light. I hope that makes sense. All right, the next thing, I want to just go back to the color grading. I want to add in a little bit more blue. I feel like we've lost a little bit of that blue. So perhaps something like that. Going to go back to the tone curve again. Now, one thing I didn't mention at the beginning of the video, if you go into this detail panel here, the image is not very noisy. It was shot at ISO 1100. Now, depending on how noisy the image is, I might run the image through AI denoise here in Lightroom. A couple of videos back, I have shared that I'm now using DxO Pure Raw 4 for all of my editing. So I would use that. But if you don't have that software or don't want to get it, using this noise reduction at any time in your workflow does remove the noise. But the problem is if you add this noise reduction during the workflow, Lightroom will then give you a new DNG file, and Lightroom will then have to create all of these AR masks again. And there's a potential that the masks might not be created exactly the same. So in the beginning of the workflow, if I was going to remove noise from this image, I would use this noise reduction in Lightroom right in the beginning. I wouldn't do it at any other time. Okay, I'm just going back to the tone curve. I feel like I want to darken some of these darks a bit here. So I'm just clicking and dragging on this tone curve just to try and find the right balance of tones in the shadows. You'll see now when I start changing the colors, this contrast will work very nicely with a more drab set of colors. So I'm happy with the look of this image so far. Besides the colors, I'm not liking the colors at the moment, but we're still working on all of the adjustments globally and locally. Now I want to create a vignette. Now you could come down to this effects panel. You could create the vignette that way, change the midpoints, change the feather. But the problem is this vignette is situated right in the middle of the image, and I don't want that. I want it to sit a little bit more to the left, but I don't want it to darken this top section here. So I'm rather going to use a radial gradient. Now I've created some vignettes here. Very basic vignettes, so I'm going to use probably vignette 1. You'll see it'll create a vignette 1 here, and now I can move this vignette to where I want it, somewhere like that. I think it's darkening it too much, and I need to fix the color grading. It's brought in a lot of blue in the corner there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract the linear gradient from the top of the image. I want to create the vignette basically for the side and the bottom. I'm going to remove it from the top here. So that's a vignette effect. Maybe a bit strong again on the dark, so I might increase the exposure just a little bit. So I'm on 0.5 there. Now going to fix this color grading, I'm going to drop or remove some of the blues here from that section of color. I might increase this a little bit later when we've worked on the colors of the image. going to go back to the subject mask we created here. And I'm just going to bring in some clarity. I want to just add in a little bit more texture to the lion. Maybe something around about +10. You could add some texture, but I like the way that clarity works. It adds in some almost some roughness or ruggedness to the contrast. And then I might just increase the exposure a little bit. And I think we're getting very strong on the contrast here. So I'm going to roll off the blacks just to remove some of that contrast. And then I might just drop a little bit on the contrast slider there. You could go into the tone curve and do that manually, but it's such a small adjustment, I would just use that contrast there. All right, so now I think we're going to work on the color. I want to work on the background separate to the lion. There are some common colors between the lion and the background. In this area here, there's lots of yellows. On the lion, there's lots of yellows. The green, we could do a global adjustment, but I'm going to split this into 2 different masks. Here, I'm going to create one subject. So I'm going to call this subject color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate and invert that. I'm going to call this background color. So I think I'm going to work on the background first. I'm going to come down to point color. And I want to start working on some of the colors. Let's start with the greens. If you followed my tutorials before, you'll know that I like to desaturate the greens. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to adjust the hue of some of these greens slightly and then desaturate them. So I'm going to click Visualize Range to see where this point color is falling. So what I can do is I like to perhaps sometimes just oversaturate the area that I'm looking at just to see where it's selecting. So you can see it's pretty much selecting everything I want at about 60. Drop that saturation. So now I'm going to adjust the hue. I'm going to make it a little bit more yellow. And then drop the saturation quite a bit. Something like that. And then I'm going to go back to the light we created, this mask 4 here. There were another mask or 2 that I could use, but this was quite a broad mask, so I'm going to use that. I'm going to increase the warmth of that mask there. Now, because we've taken away the color on the background, a lot of those greens in the background were desaturated. If I add saturation, we can bring back some of those colors. But what's really nice, if we want to warm this up even more, and let's say the colors like this image are a lot more desaturated, if you come down to this color tool here, you can actually add in a color. Now I'm going to add in some very warm lights coming from the back there. More towards red rather than the yellow. And I feel like that's going to connect nicely with the color on the lion. It's going to simplify the colors in the image and make it more cohesive. So let's just turn this mask 4 off and on. You can see the effect there. It's added in some very nice warm light from the back. So let's just go back to our background color, go back to point color, and I'm going to select these greens again. Yeah, it's selecting the right ones, and I'm going to desaturate that a bit more. I might just bring down the luminance just a touch, just to darken some of those background colors, just to help the lion sit nicely off that background. Okay, let's work on the subject. I'm going to click Subject Color Mask. I'm going to choose Point Color. I want to work on these oranges on the lion's fur. Might add some saturation. And then I might just tweak the color a little bit more towards red. Saturation shift might be a bit much there. I might just add a touch of luminance. Now, if I look at this image, it's appearing very bright. So I'm going to go back to basic. I'm going to darken that a little bit more. Raise the blacks. Potentially go back to the tone curve just to raise this area up a little bit there. As you can see, when I edit, sometimes I go back and forth doing the same thing over and over and over to get the look that I want. It's never a one click on one slider and you get the result that you like. So it's a real back and forth tug of war, I guess, with all these sliders. So that's looking really nice. I want to emphasize the color even more with some color grading. The color grading we took away just now, I think I need to bring it back just a little bit, just to bring back some more color contrast between that warmth on the background, the warmth on the lion, and the coolness of the shadows. Might just drop that slider a bit there, bring in some blues. I might add some global clarity to this image just to roughen it up a little bit more. And then I'm pretty happy with where the colors are sitting. I think I want to just adjust the skin on the lion just a little bit more. I'm going to drop the hue more towards that red color. I think that's looking quite nice. Now, if you look at the background, the area behind the lion and the area at the top of the image are very similar in brightness values. I want to even further accentuate the corner brightness. I want to add in some more brightness there. So I'm going to add a radial gradient, quite a large one. Just going to use the very corner of that gradient just to add in some very slight difference. Just using some exposure so I can have some difference between that top corner there and this area behind the lion. Let's just see what a cool white balance does. I might add in some nice mood into those shadows. Add in some tint here. I think that's looking quite nice actually. I'm going to warm this up even more. I'm going to click mask 4. I know that mask is what we used for the background in a big way. I'm going to adjust this color that we created more towards red. Well, I should say orange really, not red. Something around about there. That's that background mask off and that background mask back on. This linear gradients at the bottom, I want to make that a bit bigger just to emphasize more contrast between that light coming from the top and make this transition of that linear gradients a little bit bigger. So you can see I'm increasing the size on this linear gradients, but then I'm going to drop the whole gradient down. Something around about there. You can see the effect that darkening that foreground has. It definitely helps the viewer's eye move into the scene and follow the line of that light. Might just increase the exposure here a little bit more. For that effect there. I want to darken or desaturate the greens again on the background color. And I might do that just by warming up the white balance very slightly. And perhaps adding a little bit of a magenta shift on the tint. I think what I'm going to do is I want to pull out the purples and the magenta on the line here. I'm not a big fan of those colors. So I'm going to look for a purple hue here. That's pretty well selected. I'm just going to drop that. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take away that effect I just added. I'm going to go to Color Mixer and to the mixer here globally. And I'm just going to manually just remove purple and magenta. It's a very subtle change. Perhaps that's a bit too much. I think maybe some of the reds. That's looking a bit better. Again, I'm going to go back to color grading. See what that's doing with the shadows. Tweak these shadows a little bit there. Tweak this balance to throw the blues into deeper shadows. Just to give you an idea, that's the color grading off, so it's very warm. The whole image looks very warm. By just adding those blues, you can see it's creating some nice color contrast there. We're going to go back to the white balance. I feel like it's a little bit too on the magenta side. I'm going to drop the tints down towards green, maybe just up this exposure a bit. Just going to check the whites with the Alt key here. It's looking pretty good. That's the before and that's the after. There's a lot more mood in the image. Pretty happy with that. I think one thing I want to add in some exposure, just on this mouth here. I just want to add in a little bit more light into that mouth area. So I'm just going to do that with a simple radial gradient. with just a little bit of exposure. And then pull the image back out and look at it and see, is there anything distracting? I don't think there is. So I'm pretty happy with that effect. I think I might just increase some vibrance here. See what it does. Sometimes taking away vibrance adds in a bit of mood. It strips a bit of color away from the image. I'm liking that. Maybe some more blue on the color grading. And I'm liking that effect. Okay, and one of the last things I'm going to do is I'm going to add some sharpening. Going to zoom into 100 or 200%. Going to raise up this sharpening value here. Now on my presets, I've got 3 presets here to use for a starting point on sharpening. Just got a medium, low, and high. So let me start on the low, see what it looks like, go back to medium. This image was quite sharp to start with, so I think this might be too much. I'm going to drop the radius down to 0.5. Going to hit masking here. Just going to zoom out to 100%. Now everything that's black won't be sharpened. Everything that's white will be sharpened. This is the before, and that is the after. Editing is a powerful way to change the mood in your photos. Adding mood is something I enjoy. And in this video, you can learn more about how I do that in Lightroom.